Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on what part of the country you are tuning in from. And I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Legislative Advisory Council Advocacy Webinar. And basically, we're just going to kind of run through a quick civics test, a quick civics lesson, rather. There will be a test at the end. A quick civics lesson, and also talk about our legislative agenda and priorities, and then run through the view from the Hill. Now, our president, April Rye, is not able to join us today, and excitingly, she is actually attending an event at the White House celebrating the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act. And from what I've read so far, it has a lot to do with reducing corporate tax loopholes, a lot to do with drug prices. I haven't seen a whole lot about infrastructure yet, but I'm still looking at it, and I hope to get everyone an update on the contents of that law as soon as I can. And April may be able to give us some information as well. And just real quick before we begin the slide presentation, I wanted to let everybody know and remind everybody about the regulatory changes to the airport concessionaire and DBE program. Those were published back at the end of July, and originally all comments were due by September 19th. Now, COMTO, APTA, AMAC, and some other organizations requested that we get an extension so that we could make sure that all of our membership had a chance to review and respond thoroughly and thoughtfully. And I'm actually working on some ideas for some comments that we should highlight that affect our membership, that are actually, some of them are part of our legislative priorities already. And if we can get our membership out and support of these changes, and they'll also make our own recommendations as well, that would be really, really effective and really have an impact. But that deadline has been extended for comment until October 31st. And so we'll be getting out COMTO's position statement in the next week or so to everyone. So I just want to, we only have an hour, so I'm going to run through this very quickly. And Dante has asked me that to ask everyone to hold your questions till the end, because we've got a lot of content to go through. But please take notes, and I will try and put, Dante, you would like everyone to put the questions in the chat box, correct?
Correct. And if you could just, yes, as Renee mentioned, if you could please just place your questions in the Q&A chat at the end. We'll read them off and get your questions answered. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn my camera off. And basically, Dante, if you could, this is a picture of the Capitol, as we well know, and if we could move on to the next slide. Welcome. This information is pretty familiar to everyone. It's part of our strategic plan. It's part of our mission statement. It's on the website, but it's also helpful to review as you think about meeting or interacting with your members of Congress, to keep in mind that they don't know who COMTO is or what COMTO is about. So it's always good to refresh our memory about what our mission is and what our vision as an organization is. And we do plan to provide some leave behind for a view from the Hill, which we'll get to later. The next slide. The Legislative Advisory Council, we put this vision of our council together, and anyone on this call is welcome to join. And it's to urge our membership and to support the membership in favor of a strong and cohesive, inclusive, equitable, and viable long-term transportation policy and funding plan in Congress. And that's kind of broad because it's not specific to one piece of legislation, but it's an ongoing policy that we support. And that includes full funding through appropriations for already authorized programs, and also accountability for each of these agencies that are dispersing the funds to deliver diversity in procurement employment. But we can't do that alone. So we have to work with our public and private sector partners, our agencies, our corporate sponsors, and maintain that this momentum of infrastructure equity and inclusiveness that will result in growth, and not just today, but for future generations. Because what we hope to have happen with some of these regulations is to have them codified so that the next administration that may not be so friendly to our agenda cannot renege on what we have in place. So it'll be codified, it'll be part of law, it'll be statutory, and will last through future generations. Next slide. Okay, now for our legislative priorities, we kind of split them up: legislative and regulatory priorities. It's not like, it doesn't appear that there's going to be a standalone piece of legislation that will address most of our issues. DBE, for example, workforce development, that seems unlikely. So a lot of what we will have to do is behind the scenes, through the regulatory process, through the rulemaking process. But I'll just go through this very quickly, and people on the call who are also on the council are very familiar with this. Workforce development is a top priority for our President Rye, and so we kind of worked out some bullets and about how we would implement policies and what those policies would look like. So the first thing is to identify the skill gaps and the needs. The second is to address specifically the needs of those chronically unemployed, particularly minority, female, disabled, the constituency of COMTO. And many of these have been displaced by new technologies or by COVID, and that has to be addressed. And of course, we want to focus on historically underserved communities and focus kind of a repetition of the second bullet. We'd like to see a workforce development advisory board at USDOT. There are advisory boards at other agencies, and it would make sense to have one established at USDOT. Now, there are other advisory boards that may have overlapping responsibility with a workforce development board, but this would exclusively address those issues. We'd like to see accountability and mechanisms put in place for existing workforce development programs, and also measurements so that we can tell how well these programs are working. Importantly, we'd like to see the local authorities set hiring and training incentives that will monetize implementation of workforce development programs. That means that would give weight to bids or proposals that are inclusive of such programs or inclusive of a diverse workforce. And I believe that April is now working with USDOT to establish a paid internship, and I'm not sure what the status of that is, but she'll be updating us on that. And we want to continue to educate the public about what available internships and apprenticeships are funded by the current infrastructure bill, and so what is out there. And that's kind of part of our role too. And also we have our own internship program. Next slide. That's an important thing to mention when we meet with our members. The DBE program is, and I want to go through this really quickly because we've talked, this has kind of been our baby for the last 10 years or more. But we'd like to see, and this will be part of our comments in response to the regulations or the proposed regulations that are out there for comment now. We'd like to see more of a targeted DBE program that allows some projects to be actually set aside for DBE competition. Then that's what they do with the 8A program under SBA. And we'll see what happens with that, but it kind of makes sense because then we have small businesses or minority businesses competing on a level playing field as opposed to as a prime contractor and not as exclusively as a sub, which is what happened. The net 30 payment, prompt payment for our DBEs, that is really important. Insurance indemnification, creative solutions to meeting these bonding requirements. That's a big deal for our DBEs, particularly with the personal net worth ceiling and the size standards. It's very important to be creative about in that arena. We'd like to see a national DBE certified database. We have a database at USDOT that has a list of decertified firms, but no list of all certified firms. That is actually in the proposal for the regulations. So we very, very much support that. The PNW, that changes that, but I think it makes sense to, because cost of living is different in different parts of the country, it may make sense to adjust for regional differences in the cost of living and then reflect that in the personal net worth ceilings. We'd like to see a codified statutory increase in the DBE goals attached to FTA, FAA, FHWA, and of course FRA, because right now that it's still set at 10%, even though many agencies do exceed that goal, and many agencies don't meet that goal. But we'd still like to see it increase from 10%, which has been in place for over 40 years. Back to DBE size standards, as I mentioned, we want to just have that consistent with FAA across the board at USDOT, and that is also in the proposed regulations. We'd like to see an incentivized mentor-protege program. There is a mentor-protege program in place at USDOT. It really doesn't give the primes any incentive to adopt or acquire a protege. And so we'd like to see some kind of incentive, and also an incentive that will cover the gap year so that when companies graduate from the program, they don't immediately fail or have to slide back into the program. So there should be something to address that. And of course, we support the administration's Justice 40 initiative, which is an equity initiative that will attempt to deliver 40% of benefits of federal investments to climate and clean energy that will also address that specifically in minority communities. Next slide. Importantly, thank you, is our addition, and I want to thank the Accessibility Committee. It's very important for us to highlight the urgent need for accessibility and equality in the disabled community, for the disabled in the transportation community, including special needs safety protocol. We want to educate the employers on the benefits of hiring persons with disabilities, including those with neurodiverse candidates. And we have been approached by Senator Duckworth on several occasions to support legislation that she's sponsored that actually addresses this very, very specific issue. And thanks to her, we will also be working with her for View from the Hill. It is her office who has secured our meeting space in the Capitol Visitors Center. So that's been an important relationship we've developed over the last year. And if you have any questions, there's the info at COMTOnational.org. I just put legislative activities in the subject line. And if you have any questions, I will hope Dante will forward those to me. Next slide. Now, how we work. Now, we do not lobby. So it's important to make that clear. We advocate. And we do that, and the council does that, but it's important for the whole membership to be engaged. We actively engage the key congressional transportation and full committee and subcommittee leaders, including budget and appropriations, not just transportation and infrastructure. And we're going to work this year with a live view from the Hill. And also we've got the live Transportation Brain Trust event during the CBC ALC weekend. And that is again chaired this year by Representative Andre Carson and sponsored by COMTO. So that will be on the CBC website. At every level, we need to educate our political leaders, our transportation agency leaders, all of our stakeholders, corporate executives, and the board members, that's C-suite. We need to educate them on diversity issues. And we do that by collaborating with other trade organizations, APTA, AASHTO, of course, AMAC, and build alliances and partnerships. And through our council networks and our all 37 chapters, now 37, we need to promote high visibility for our legislative and regulatory priorities, not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local levels. Next slide. Dante. Now, here's where we get the civics lesson, how a bill becomes law. Next slide. It's kind of like making sausage. It's ugly, it's messy, it's complicated, but sometimes tasty at the end. So this is, I don't think I need to kind of go through this specifically because we're going to address it a little in a couple of slides later. But the House and the Senate, as you know, work separately, independent of each other. They're working on an issue that the House may have its version on. Let's use infrastructure as an example. The House had its version, the Senate had its version. It works its way through committee, works through subcommittee, works its way through the full committee, works its way through to what's called conferencing. The two sides, and it's usually the staff, the two staff meet and don't forget to build your practice with the new affirmation. Try to work out their differences and issue a report. You can take a look at this at your leisure if you like, but Dante, if you could go to the next slide. Don't forget to build your practice with a new affirmation. If you hear anything in the background, that's Alexa talking to me, reminding me to drink water. In any event, how a bill becomes law. Legislation is introduced, and any member can introduce a piece of legislation. In the House, it's handed to the clerk, placed in the hopper, as they say. But in the Senate, members have to gain recognition of the presiding officer to announce introduction of a bill. And that's why the leadership in the Senate is so important, because they actually decide who can introduce a bill. And it can be, if anybody objects, it gets postponed or it doesn't get introduced at all. So it takes a more of a consensus, I'd say, in the Senate. In any case, the bills, if they are introduced and it is accepted in the House and the Senate, they're given an HR number. It's House I want to say House rule or House or Senate bill. It's Senate bill, and it's HR or S number, depending on what if it's the House or the Senate. And in each case, the bill is then referred to the appropriate committee, which is then referred to the appropriate subcommittee. And in the House, it's done by the Speaker, and in the Senate, the presiding officer, or sometimes by the House or Senate parliamentarian. Next slide. Now, this is where COMTO can have its most the best impact, the fullest impact, and that's during hearings. And so that's why our relationships with those subcommittee members and that subcommittee staff are so important, because we are able to and we have been able, April's been able to sit in and give testimony at these hearings. The subcommittees have their hearings depending on their jurisdiction over the legislation. It could be transit, it would go to the transit subcommittee. Railroad would go to the railroad subcommittee, et cetera, et cetera. Then the subcommittee report their findings, a result of the hearings, to the full committee. They make changes to the bill and they report it to the full committee. And then there's a vote. There's also, there could be hearings at the full committee as well. Then there's a debate at the full committee level, and questions are asked by both sides, because there's either the two parties usually have their own questions and to ask at the hearing or about the bill. Then when the bill is reported, the committee staff prepares a written report. It's kind of the language that explains the language in the bill. There's that legislative language that gets very complicated, but there's also a report that goes with that explains and kind of gives historical context to the language in the bill. Or people who oppose the bill will also have their say and write a dissenting opinion. Then the report is sent back to the whole chamber and placed on the calendar for a vote. And in the House, most bills go to the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee determines what procedures will govern that bill and how it will be considered by the House. For example, a closed rule would set strict time limits on debate and would forbid the introduction of amendments. Otherwise, they would entertain amendments at the full on the floor for the full House. Next slide. As I said, the legislation is placed on the calendar. They don't always come to the floor in the same order, and of course, some bills never reach the floor at all. And the Speaker in the House and the Majority Leader have control over that. Legislation in the Senate is placed on the legislative calendar, also an executive calendar, to deal with items that are exclusive to the Senate, like treaties and nominations. Those don't go to the House. Those are exclusive to the Senate. The scheduling of the legislation is the job of the Majority Leader. And so he's got a lot of control, a lot of power in the Senate. And so that's why it's so important, and I'll get to that later again, to vote, because that will determine so many of these important issues in the Senate. Next slide. This just kind of goes on how the debate is limited. Again, I think it's kind of a repeat. The Rules Committee in the House determines what goes on in terms of the debate and how much time is allotted to each person. In the Senate, the Senate has to agree by unanimous consent or by voting to adopt a motion to proceed in order to even consider the bill. So, and then once they do consider the bill, they can propose amendments and infinitely to that. There's no time limit to debate. And that's why we have the result of that is the filibuster, as most of us are familiar with. Next slide. Okay, this is just more of the same. The bill, if the bill is voted on, if it passes, it's sent to the other chamber. The other chamber probably already has its own version of or a similar measure under consideration. But if either chamber does not pass the bill, it goes away. But the House and the Senate both pass the same bill, which now almost never happens, that it would be sent directly to the president. More than likely, the House and Senate will pass different bills, and that means it has to go to a conference, and that there's representatives from both houses, the House and the Senate, generally the staff, that will get together and meet and work out the differences. It's made up of senior members who are appointed by the officers of the committee who originally dealt with the bill. So, for example, T&I would, Mr. DeFazio would appoint the conference members to work on an infrastructure bill. And in the Senate, of course, it works a little differently, because with the infrastructure bill, there are 3 committees that have jurisdiction. That's Public Works, Commerce, and I believe Banking, because banking has transit. So that's one reason why it was so difficult to get that infrastructure bill through the Senate. It was 3 committees working on 3 different sections of the bill, and then to complicate it, it had to go to the Senate, had to be voted to get to the Senate floor. So that is, it's kind of complicated there. Next slide. And then the president is sent to the president for review. He signs it, and if he doesn't sign it within 10 days and Congress is in session, it automatically becomes law, even if he doesn't sign it. But if Congress is in adjournment and the president does not sign it and doesn't actively veto it, it becomes a pocket veto, just a veto by default. If he does veto it, it gets sent back to Congress, and then Congress might try and work out the differences between the administration and their bill, and then they will either send it back to the president or they will override the veto, and then it becomes law. And then once it becomes law, it's signed by the president and assigned an official law number. And that is what is happening today at the White House, where President Rye is celebrating the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide. Executive orders are kind of interesting, and the most important one in my mind was the one that President Biden signed his first month in office, and that was the one on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So it's using the power of the federal government to assert his will, and it doesn't have to go through Congress, doesn't have to be approved by the House or the Senate, and it becomes law unless the Congress passes legislation to override it. And most likely it would get a presidential veto in most situations. Next slide. Okay, this is the important part. View from the Hill is going to be September 29th, 8:30 to 11, although we have the room until, thanks to Senator Duckworth, we have the room till noon, so we can actually kind of network afterwards. But the important thing is that we want everybody to reach out. Next slide, Fonte. Let me see if that's where. Yes. So what we would like everybody to do is to make their own appointments. I know we tried, like National tried to set up appointments for our members that did not work out very well. So it's best if individuals who are attending View from the Hill, or even if you're not coming to View from the Hill, visit congress.gov and find out who your representative and who your senator is. It sounds that kind of, sometimes I take that for granted that people know that, but I shouldn't, because this is an easy place to find out who represents you at the federal level. And so you can go to their websites. And right now, because most people are working remotely, there will be a form that you have to complete asking for requesting a meeting. And they will let them know what the meeting is about, and let them know that you are a constituent and a COMTO member, and that you will be in Washington, D.C. on September 29th, and you'd like a few minutes of their time. not now, you have to consider that they're busy, and you may end up actually meeting with a member of their staff that handles transportation issues. That's fine, because we want to meet with the members face to face. That's our preference. But it is the staff who does the work. So a staff member is a very good ally. Next slide. Now this is where I was talking about voting, and I'm not assuming that everybody on this webinar or everybody at COMTO is of the same party. So, but regardless, it's important for each member of COMTO to exercise the right of and cast their vote, encourage other people to do so too, and also engage at the local level to get people to the poll. These elections are important not just at the national level, but even more importantly at the state and local level, because that's where the money from the federal level is funneled through, and that's what we're looking for. We're following the money. That's very important. And your voice, your vote is your voice, and one vote, believe me, does make a difference. So as individuals, as members of your organization, as members of our organization, on behalf of your agency, your company, your community, it is important to vote and to get other people to vote. As I said, you know, those controlling parties in the House have so much, in the Congress have so much power. It's so important to put leaders in that, whoever they are, that are reflect your perspective and reflect your political point of view. Next slide. So in preparation, whether you're going to be at view view from the Hill or not, it is important to reach out to your representative. And it's kind of common sense. You need to know who he is or she is or they are. And so you want to know what party, their committee assignments. It's all on their website. Their position on issues, their voting history, it's all available. It's all transparent and on public record on their website. Find something that you all have in common. Sometimes in their bios, there is they have personal hobbies and things like that. You can relate to them on a personal level, find shared interests. Then we will have the prepared talking points and leave behind. So the part of this is so that we can understand, so everyone can understand COMTO's position and priorities and be prepared to explain and also to maybe, you know, counter the arguments if there's an opposition to what we're saying. But I think that most elected officials are reasonable and do want to try and understand both sides of the issue. They might not agree, but they will try and listen. Next slide. Now this is always something that I make a point of when I write a letter. The first thing you say is, you know, we appreciate your support and we appreciate your work in Congress. We may not, but we still want to say that we appreciate their service, their public service. You know, could present it that way. And it's also important to present a positive image. And you'd be surprised how you know, when I worked on the Hill, when people would come into our offices, I mean, it's not an elitist thing, but it's important to make a good impression, a lasting impression, and to develop good rapport. And I think everybody, we don't need to go into detail on that. I think all of us are professional enough, but it's important to stay on topic because again, I have been in meetings where there's been a group of people and they kind of ramble and instead of presenting a united front. So if your chapter can get together as a group and visit your member of Congress. It's important that you keep that conversation on topic and that your group presents a united front. Now, I also would suggest that if you can, that the chapters join together to go in groups. That is to say, the members of a chapter, for example, the New York chapter, the Philadelphia chapter, et cetera, and visit the members, not just one-on-one, but 3 or 4 on one. And that actually carries a lot of weight. And also, you know, the elected officials, sometimes they'll try to give you their standard company line, so to speak, and they'll get into other issues. But we want to keep, make the best use of the time that we have with that member, and don't let them get off topic either. And then ask for advice. You know, they appreciate that you're asking not just an ask, but that you also are asking them for advice. You know, and let them know that you want to reach out to other elected officials and their colleagues and ask and just get some feedback. We will also be providing you with a feedback sheet that you can take notes on. Either I think actually, Dante, that's going to be online and not a piece of paper, but maybe sometimes it's easier just to take notes as you're right after the meeting on a piece of paper as well. But the form will also be online. Next slide. Of course, don't argue. That is like the worst thing. We don't want to get into any controversy. And if possible, leave your member undecided, and without arguing, without pushing too hard. You know, just kind of given that window that he might say, well, I'll give it some thought, or even the staff person who will say, well, that's not, I'll see what my boss thinks about it. And you'll say, yeah, great, good. That's a good idea. So he's not against it. I'll talk to him about it, so that's important. And this is actually what we were referring to. We don't want to take notes during the meeting, but it's important to take notes like immediately after, so you don't forget, in my opinion. And as soon as you finish, find a quiet place and take some notes, and then we'll have the form, as I said, that you can complete. And that kind of will give us a measure of how effective these visits to the Hill actually are. Next slide. And don't be, sometimes, especially if we're talking about in the infrastructure bill, we don't know everything that's in it. And so, if he comes, if we don't know about something, we admit it. Or if they have a question about COMTO and you don't know it right off the bat, right off the top of your head, you say that this is information that I'm sure is available, and we will get back to you with an answer. And it's a great opportunity to follow up with your elected official. And it's also a great way to be a resource and to continue to be a resource and offer COMTO as a resource to your member. I think it goes without saying that you don't want to interrupt, you just listen, because they like to hear themselves talk, but it's try not to interrupt. And it's important to leave, as I said at the very beginning, leave a good impression. We don't want them to feel angry or alienated from COMTO or from yourself personally. So, but you don't have to emphasize a difference of opinions. Again, leave that window open for further discussion. Next slide. Okay, and now if they are supportive or if they're enthusiastic, that's great. Be enthusiastic right back. Offer to provide additional information. We offer COMTO as the organization, our membership as a resource, COMTO National, and we have an amazing span and scope of expertise among our membership. If they're really opposed, think about how you can follow up, but you do have to move on at some point. but I'll always follow up. And, you know, as I say here, to think about ways to neutralize their opposition, but also if they're undecided, again, this is always a way to get back into their offices, get back into they're on their radar, and always say thank you by sending a follow-up email or letter. That is really important. And if you can, put it on chapter letterhead. Next slide. Oh, and that's just something else, because I know that many of your the chapters have done that. You know, invite a local staff, or when the member is in the district, invite them to a chapter meeting, or if you're an agency member, have them visit a public project underway, or gives them a tour. But it's important also to stay in regular contact. We don't want to just show up once a year and say hi, remember me from 2 years ago. But so it's important to stay in regular contact. Get to know the staff. I've kind of emphasized that all through the slideshow. It's important that these relationships are maintained, and the staff, unfortunately, the staff does change. So it's important to keep up with the changes in the staff. If there's somebody new in the district, or if there's somebody new in your congressional member's office on the Hill, then it's important to keep that regular contact so that you're aware of that. And of course, you keep COMTO National advised of your efforts and your successes. And you know, it's not on here, but if there's a problem and there's a failure, or somebody is really, really negative, then let us know that too, because maybe we can, you know, we may have some contacts where we can make a difference. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to go on camera, and Dante, I guess the questions will be in the Q&A or the chat box. I'm not sure how you're doing this, but Dante is going to read any questions.
Yep, and thank you, Renee. Thank you for that wonderful presentation as we prepare for our legislative initiatives at the end of this month. So
Yes.
I'll go into the Q&A chat at this time. So far, we've only have 2 questions, which is good. That means the information was comprehensive. So I'll begin with the first question. And so actually, this one is more of a comment. And this person says, I understand that the action we do is educate, not lobby nor advocate officially. Did you want to add or add anything to that, Renee?
I'm sorry, we advocate and educate, not lobby. What is the question again?
That's exactly what it says. It says,
Yeah.
I understand that the action we do is educate, not lobby nor advocate. Right. I think it was more so just a comment.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And that's important, because you get into all kinds of trouble if we use the word lobby or lobbyist.
Thank you. So the next question of this person asked, will the visit to Washington, D.C. be conducted annually around the same time of the year?
Yes, that's a good question, because a few years ago, we were scheduled View from the Hill in March to coincide with the Celebrating Women Who Moved the Nation. But for 3 years in a row, we got snowed out. So we kept having to reschedule it to the fall. And so it just kind of made sense to schedule it for the fall permanently, that coincide during a time that coincides with the Congressional Black Caucus annual legislative conference. So it's a CBC ALC. And so it makes sense. The members are there. Most of the members aren't in town, and there's not a lot of votes going on, so we can get staff people there to the View from the Hill, and it's a little more predictable. The schedule is a little more predictable because of the CBC. It also coincides, somewhat overlaps with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Conference. I think there's a little bit of overlap, a day or two, but there's overlap. So it's a good time. It's worked out for the last, since our last couple of live events. So it might be a different weekend depending on the Black Caucus, because it's really how they schedule it, but it will be during Black Caucus weekend.
Thank you, Renee, for that answer. So the next question we have is, should we send the letter via mail or hand deliver the letter?
That's a good question. If you, I never suggest mail. The snail mail is literally snail mail on the Hill. So I would put the letter, if I can help you identify a staff member, or if you call the office and ask the name or the email address for the transportation legislative assistant, the legislative assistant who handles transportation, and they will give you an email address and you can email the letter. And to me, that is, and if anybody disagrees, I don't know, just please speak up, but that is the most efficient way for me to reach a member through their staff through email. Now, if you go in person, and I think that's even better. If you will be at the View from the Hill in person, then take that letter with you. Absolutely. That'll be one of your leave behinds.
All right, thank you so much for that answer, Renee. So the next question we have, this person asked, as we capture comments from our DBE membership on the DBE NPRM, how do we go about getting that to COMTO headquarters? Okay,
that is info. Now, and I think this is April's preference. You would provide your comments and send it to COMTO National info. Is that the best email address, Dante?
Yeah, so it would be info@comtonational.org. I'll put that in the chat as well.
And that way we can submit them. It's not necessary to do it that way, but I think that is April's preference.
And you're correct. She probably would say the same thing. So thank you for that, Renee. I'm moving on to the next question. This person says, thank you, Renee, for this very informative presentation. Does COMTO headquarters have a list of accommodations for members to stay during View from the Hill and CBCF Brain Trust? If so, can it be shared to the members? Okay, Dante, I'm going to let you take that one. So as of right now, there are not. However, April has sent out available accommodations that are in the area, but unfortunately there aren't any room blocks available. However, we do have the information for accommodations in the area, and we can definitely get that information out to all the members that plan to attend. Now, I understand the board meeting is going to be at the Renaissance, but it's sold out. Is that correct? Correct. Yes. So if my recollection is correct, yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. So this person says, it is great to hear COMTO's goal for long-term commitments. To support the Conference of Minority Transportation Officials' goal for long-term commitments, it will be beneficial to clarify as needed and reiterate COMTO's role in facilitating successful transitions from underserved and disadvantaged communities throughout fundamental educational achievements toward advanced educational track and future employment pathways. Now, Renee, I don't know if you want to add up to that, but I believe this was just solely a comment. A comment, yeah. Actually, if I could get a copy of that comment and see how I could work it into, maybe there's something I can add to workforce development. And I know that HBCUs are an important component of what April's outreach is going to be, is not going to be, is. So
maybe I can work that into some of our comments or part of our priorities.
Yes,
So-
and I took note of that comment. And I will send it to you after this webinar.
Okay.
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 Thank you for that. Moving on to the next question. So this person asked, is COMTO providing help to make the appointment with our representatives, or do we have to do it individually?
Okay, that's a very good question. I did address it at one point. So a few years ago, National did try. I think we hired somebody, or not. You guys hired somebody to help set up those meetings with the members, and it was a nightmare. So National is not doing that this year. You would have to go to, and I guess it's a couple. This slideshow will be available on the website. But there's, I believe it's congress.gov, and you can identify who your member is, and you just give them a call. And so we will have View from the Hill, 8:30 to 11, and we've got the room till noon. But it's 8:30 to 11 will be the actual event, and then anytime after 11, you can set up a meeting with your member or their staff. So when you call, it would be September 29th, either late morning or afternoon, or actually anytime that day. So it would depend on your member's schedule and also on your schedule for that day. So the short answer is no, National is not doing that. You would have to set up your own appointment.
All right, thank you for that, Renee. And actually, okay, so at this particular point, all the questions that we're getting is just regard to obtaining this presentation. So we can definitely send this to everyone who participated during this webinar. And looks like another question came in. Okay, so this person asked, to supplement View from the Hill, might it be worth for individuals who cannot travel to DC to set up meetings with congressional local offices during the year?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is ideal. It's not, like I said, it's not like we just want to show up once a year. It's important to meet with your member while he's in the district. Become familiar with the staff of the district offices. That is critical. Absolutely.
All right, thank you for that, Renee. With that, that was the last question that was sent to the Q&A. We are at 2:53. Unless there are no more questions for the Q&A, I'll toss it back over to you, Renee, to close us out.
Okay, well, I really appreciate everybody joining today, and I know it was kind of short notice, and but I really appreciate your getting on. And if there's any assistance that I can provide or any clarification in terms of what our legislative agenda will be, or if you have any feedback in terms of the letters that I think you all received copies of the templates, and we'll also have, like I said, leave behinds. But if there's any assistance I can be between now and then, it's only like 2 weeks away, and we weren't real sure about Mr. Carson's plans, so we were trying to make sure that we had the View from the Hill the day before the Transportation Brain Trust. The Transportation Brain Trust is now on Friday, and it's much earlier in the day. It's at 11:30 to 1, and that was based on Mr. Carson's wishes, and that is his privilege. So I do apologize if it seems like such short notice, but we weren't getting clear information from the Hill. But I appreciate you all joining, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon. Are there any new questions, Dante?
Nope, there are no new questions.
All right, great. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.